until it come to the time for the great myriad bird, the Missouri, to begin its ascent, its challenge against the earth, the paradoxical oracle of wind, wings beating, unchaining, outboarding as seamen might say, the great breast ruffled and rising as in all the great legends. But this happening here before me, under me now, wonderfully surrounding me, the white, silver, louvered, feather shift and chevron stretching out across the sunlight, the great terrible beauty and beating we have always heard about, beating, beating upward and forward, the planks of its shape shivering at first like a ship, like a dhow, then settling down into smooth as we move upwards. Now the first hills at the darker mountains of English, the sea below all silver like our shadow, the beacon topaz eyes unblinking even through all the shudder, the wings now stretched across all space openly and awesomely, so that we are not beating anymore, but sailing, sailing, something like singing, because at last I have been able to use all the words in the language as long as I lay them out softly and carefully, like these unfluttering feathers of song, like the sea below turning into a gray ball without fishes, like the darkness no longer lingering above us, but we moving towards it as part of its fuse and its future, the Ayesha of Sails one last time in our ears, the earth gone a long time now, green spur arrogance of John Crow Mountain. Strange, not even the memory of a carefree river in these places. Too far up now for sunsets, through all this rain and silence in our eyes, on our cheeks, on our faces. The metaphor at last afloat, almost a light in the darkness, a light in the darkness, a light in the darkness. That is a recent poem, and I thought I would begin with that this evening because I want to do something quite difficult in honor of my presence here. It's such a wonderful thing to be back here in Washington. I was last here in the early 80s, I think it was, or even the late 70s. Made many friends, some of whom are here this evening. And I thought I would let them know and let you know through them what I have been doing since then. This poem is an example of some of the work that's happening where you get a very careful interweaving of images and songs as this bird tries to ascend beyond the metaphorical pull of the earth. But it didn't start that way. And what I want to do is to give you some idea, some small idea of how my poetry is really formed. Because there's a considerable body of work, a lot of it which is practically unknown, not only in this country, but generally. And one wonders why sometimes that is the situation. So I thought it would be important for you, since you are very much involved in the arts, to let you understand how this poetry begins. How is it that a person from the small island of Barbados, Little England, but at the same time the nearest of all landfalls to Africa, how a person in this colonial space, of only 21 miles long and 14 miles wide, which is as wide as a boulevard here in Washington, I suppose, has been able to produce this kind of work. And I say it because I know I'm very much aware of the production itself. I know that because of what happened to me, there is a kind of unsolicited desire to understand certain things about my own environment. And this comes about because the environment itself has been closed to us. Although we live in a very beautiful setting, although we live in this magnificent Caribbean, it is not an everyday breathing experience to understand it. Because the educational system, the whole procedure of colonialism, nowadays we talk about post-colonialism, but we still breathe colonialism. It's still very much there. This made it very difficult for people like myself, like George Lamming, like all the writers of that generation that came out in the 60s to really write with any ease. It was confident, but it wasn't easy. And I'll give you an example. I am born within the sound of the sea. The lips of the sea speak to me even as I open my eyes. I remember the first image I have is opening my eyes and seeing a light on the wall of my room and wondering what that light was. And as my eyes followed the light that was playing on the wall of my room, it spilled onto the ceiling and it spilled towards the window. And when I looked through the window, I saw the sea glistening in the sunlight. And I wanted right away to become a part of that sea, a part of that ocean, and I wanted to be able to write about it. I grew up on the beaches of Barbados, and my poetry was a desire to write about that sunlight on the pores of my skin, the crunch of the coral sand on the soles of my feet, that sense of distance between myself and the solar cosmos, and that same sense of intimacy and nearness of the warmth. I wanted to be able to connect my island to the rest of the Caribbean because I knew those islands were there across the horizon, over the horizon, under the horizon. But I couldn't find a way to write about it. Because in school, which is the great influence, the emphasis, the model that was being drummed into us was of an entirely different nature. It was not to do with light glittering on the wall of my room. In fact, it was, as you know, the iambic pentameter, to put it very crudely. The boy stood on the burning deck. To be or not to be, that is the question. And then you get the images, fair daffodils, we weep to see you haste away so soon. Never knew what daffodils were, but we learned them and it affected. So when I tried to write a poem about my experience of this beach, it was John Keats that came to mind. So that when the sea washed up on the beach and left a little pool, that little memory of ocean, I wanted to write about the pools that were left as a memorial on our beaches. But John Keats had said that pools in somewhere were lonely. They probably had tuberculosis. They certainly lived in a garret. And so my pools became very delicate little, very precious things, which did not reflect the color of the pool. It did not reflect the way that the water ruffled the surface of the pool, and it never could reflect the way that the pool was recaptured by the ocean every night. So it was a problem, how to write the history of the islands, how to begin my own genesis. That was the big challenge. So I said, okay, here are the Caribbean islands. You looked at the map and you saw this archipelago, 3,000 miles of wonderful beauty stretching from the tip of Florida right around to the Venezuelan coast. How do I write about that? This curve of islands. I said, if God created the Caribbean, how would he have started to do this? And strangely enough, I wanted to know what sound would God have listened to, or would God have created as he created the islands. I had a feeling right early then that creation, Genesis, and song were very important. But the song that I got when I tried to create my islands was bum bum, bum hum. And somehow the islands did not have that kind of drama. They didn't have that kind of drama. They didn't have that kind of darkness, that kind of presence. So I realized that that would not be the answer. Nor was Milton's wonderful organ music, because the islands are very pointilliste things. They're light. The light flickers on the water very sensitively. The flying fish, those silver creatures, you know, they have a rainbow evanescence as they float through the air. When I heard a hurricane, for instance, that wonderful deep song that comes out of Africa, the hurricane does not shout in pentameters. There was a completely different song which I knew I had to capture if I was to begin to write the genesis of the islands. And you know, year after year I tried, and I fell back all the time into these Keatsian or Wordsworthian or Miltonic strophes. Until one day, I took a pebble, you know, children, male and female, but particularly the males, and I see some adults too, whenever they come near to a body of water, always want to look for some kind of stone or pebble and throw it onto the water. I don't know what kind of primordial desire that is, but you'll see it in films. You read about people, anytime they go near a water, they're talking and chatting. They want to throw pebbles in the water. Now, we had a whole skill about this, and the whole game that we played was you look for the right kind of pebble, smooth with a certain shape, and you skidded it along the water, called ducks and drakes. And the person who could skid the most times was the person who was the champion. And I was pretty good at this. And one day I said, you know, if God created the Caribbean, he would have started with his stone from my hand, if you like, and every skid of the stone on the water would have been the bloom of an island. I knew that. I said, if God created that movement from Florida to the Venezuelan coast, it would have been a stone that he skidded on the water, and the inertia of that skidding stone would have created the curve, and it would have ended right on that little blob, which you know as Trinidad, Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. But I still couldn't get that skid as boom-a-dum-boom. You see, those songs do not skid. There's nothing pointilliste about that. So I couldn't get it. I could not get it. Next thing that happened was 24th of May, we used to have parades in honor of the English king, King George V, King George VI, Queen Elizabeth II. And along my street, now here's my house, it's called the Round House. This is the IDB Bank. You all should begin to know these great landmarks of the Caribbean. Mine is called the Round House. It needs a plaque to show that it, you know, these things happen there. At the moment, the house is neglected. These are important aspects of archive and therefore of memory and therefore of civilization. Our house looked onto the beach at Browns Bay and onto the street at Bay Street. So if I was going south, I would see my waves. And if I was going north, I looked through the window and I could see these things happening. And outside my window on the 24th of May came the governor's parade. Governor on his horse, Englishman, plumes, white helmet. Behind him, the trombones, the tubas, the big brass bands, the drums, boom, 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 boom. You know, those wonderful parades, everybody marching. And I saw the march. I said, no, of course, I was attracted. You know, you have the rifles, you have the glitter of the instruments, and you have the wonderful precision of the soldiers. And you know, you have left, right, left, right, left. Beautiful, beautiful, but pentameter. Pentameter. This is what won the Battle of Waterloo. This is what made us what we were, forgetful, made us colonial. The Battle of Waterloo was won on the plain fields of Eton, and the plain fields of Eton were pentametric squares. That's how Wellington got to know how to do this thing. And here they were importing it into our society and preventing me from writing the history of the islands. Because that left, right, rum dum, da 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 rum, was still not the little skid of the islands. Until the day that my relatives, some of my aunts, some of my sisters, decided that on this occasion they were going to join this parade. So naturally I was particularly interested in seeing them in the parade. You know, if you know there's somebody in a parade, you watch for them. Normally I would have watched the soldiers only. You know, this is what interested me, this wonderful rigid marching. But the rest of the parade, you know how it is when after a mile of marching, the music is no longer heard at the back, and people begin to straggle. Lesser people not in such beautiful uniforms begin to straggle, and then when it is worse, civilians don't bother at all. They just mumble along. But my aunts were there in this thing, and I was watching for them. And for the first time, I saw something I had never seen before, although I should have. There they were with their baskets and so on. And the first set of them, although they could barely hear boom, 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 they were they were trying to catch up with the pentameter. They were marching, they were trying to go left, right, but they were doing a little chip step, you know, try to catch up with the soldiers. So I said, no, that is interesting. But then, even more alarming, in a way, more amazing, is that the women at the very back, who had got by this time quite large and beautiful, with their baskets, they were not bothering to march to this music at all. They were beginning to form circles, completely different cosmology. Instead of going along left, right, left, or even left, right, left, they were saying left, right, left, and they started to do that. They were dancing, they were listening to a different drama, you know, the praise. And I said, it is this different drama that I have to try to understand if I'm to write my poem. And I remember the evening, I suppose, that I suddenly realized what this different music was. And I had known it all along. It's one of the ancient music of the Caribbean, and at the same time the newest music of the Caribbean. You know, and the poem that I was able to write as a result reads like this. The stone had skidded, arced and bloomed into islands. And you see the image that I had already had encoded in my mind. Cuba and San Domingo, Jamaica and Puerto Rico, Grenada, Guadeloupe, Bonaire, curved stone hissed into reef, so on. So this becomes my first poem, my trigger poem. But the point is that although it is written on the page in something that you might scan as a version of the pentameter, it isn't that at all. What happened to me that evening when I suddenly brought together the music of the Caribbean and my image of Genesis was the calypso, a music which we had always had, but which, believe it or not, had been banned from our consciousness. Sundays in Barbados when I was growing up, the rediffusion, as we called it, we had a radio that, you know, instead of having radios in those days, there was one monolithic station that piped the music into our homes. You just paid $4 and you got this music, this music and other things all day long and all night long. But on Sundays, they could not play calypso. And if at home I started whistling a calypso, my father would ask me, what's that? What's that? And the whole implication was that you don't want to do that kind of thing, do you, if you want to get on? That was and at school there was never there was drink to me only with thine eyes, but never Nora, Nora. So the calypso, although it was always there as a catacorner, an eye corner of ghost, was never part of my confident consciousness. Until that evening when I said, if God skidded the stone, it would have to be with the rhythm of the calypso, and he was quite right. This is how the poem really goes. The stone had, and I heard it that way, and I couldn't write the notes on the page, at least not yet. Later on in a new edition, I hope I'll be able to find ways of making it easy for the people to understand. But this is how the calypso and the image of Genesis were combined. The stone had skidded, arced and bloomed into islands, Cuba, San Domingo, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Grenada, Guadalupe, Bonaire. Curved stone hissed into reef, wave teeth fanged into clay, white splash flashed into spray, Bathsheba, Montego Bay, bloom of the arcing summers. And that was the beginning of my poetry. That is the very beginning, what I call the trigger of a whole set of things that bring me to this point, that permit me to write that poem, Bird Rising, which I started with. After that, I began to understand things about the Caribbean as a result of the discovery of that metaphor. I began to discover things about the Caribbean which I did not know I knew. I want you to understand that metaphor has a way of creating its own knowledge. It has a way of leading you into areas that you would normally not be conscious of. I was able to go on to write, the islands rode into green plantations ruled by silver sugar cane, sweat and profit, cutlass profit, islands ruled by sugar cane. And that is a whole history of the Caribbean, which in school we were never taught. In school we were taught that the date to remember, 2 dates to remember, easy to pass an exam. 1066, the invasion of England by William the Conqueror, and 1492, when Columbus discovered the Caribbean. Slavery, 400 years of slavery in the Americas, never mentioned. When our leading literary godfather produced Agatha Christie's play, and he's very influential, 10 Little Niggers, he didn't say 10 Little Niggers in the brochure, it became 10 Little Indians, because the whole idea was that niggers did not exist in the Caribbean. That means Africans did not exist in the Caribbean, black people did not exist in the Caribbean. Slavery had not existed. The books began to explain to us that they had invited 50,000 Africans to come to work in Barbados, if you please. No union rights or anything mentioned, but it was an invitation situation which, and not only that, but the Africans were very pleased to have accepted. I'm telling you, these things create warps in your mind, and it would have been difficult to write about that with that ignorance if I had not been able to skid the stone upon the poem, upon its own poem. The stone had skidded, arced and bloomed into islands, Cuba, San Domingo. The islands roared into green plantations ruled by silver sugar cane. And the whole poetry, the whole of Rites of Passage, that first book of the first trilogy, comes out of that discovery that a stone skids on the water, not in pentameter or in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but in the ancient new rhythm of the kaiso. That's the first thing that happened. And after that, it was easy. Rhythm after rhythm began to appear, and each one led me to discoveries, you know. In a little shanty tongue was on a night like this. Girls were sitting down around the tongue like this. Some were young and some were brung. I even found a miss who was black and brown and really did the twist. Brother man, the Rasta man, beard full of lichen, brain full of lice, watched the mice come up through the floorboards of his downtown shanty-tongue kitchen and smiled. Down, down, white man, con man, brung man, dung, dung, full man, frowning Batman, that white black man that lives in the town. Rise, rise, Locks man, Solomon, wise man, rise, 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 let me laugh them. See, I'm beginning to use the rhythms that are the rhythms of the people. And that means that I'm avoiding the tyranny of the pentameter. I'm decolonizing my poetry. And in doing that, I'm able to discover areas which would not have been possible without that discovery. Had I remained fixed into the Wordsworthian, into the Tennysonian, into the Matthew Arnold mode, I would not have been able to write a poem about Rastafari, and I would never have been able to write a poem about my own grandfather, which is one of the most important discoveries and advancements, if you like, within the poetry. Because you see, we had been taught, again, I have to repeat these things, because luckily we have now reached a phase where you take it for granted that it is not like that. And the younger generation of Caribbean writers have now been able to accept these things as perfectly normal. But I want you to understand how in that early phase it was very, very difficult to get things done in that way. If you do not write poems about your family, you're not writing poetry. You can write about roses, about lonely pools. You can write about, you can write about abstractions, you can write about pyramids in a strange way. But that intimacy, that connection between yourself and your roots, and when I say roots, I mean organic roots, family roots, unless you can do that, the poetry cannot grow, because it is your relatives who must be given a face. The same way you begin to find words for your imagination, that imagination must encompass your own relatives, your own family, your own community, eventually your own nation. I say this because, let me give you one horrible example. I was asked not to do it by the person because he's now a very well-known radical writer, very well-known indeed. But when he was growing up in Guyana, I say no more than that, Princess Margaret visited Guyana, and he wrote a poem about her beautiful blue eyes, and he really went, he went into ecstasy about, he was willing to do the Sir Francis Raleigh, Sir Walter Raleigh thing. He would throw the metaphors of his love at her feet. He was really taken up with Princess Margaret, who became a cynosure, but he never could write about his own sister. See what I mean? So you're giving privilege to the people who are pentametric in you, and not really being able to give the alternative, which is your own situation. Even today in the Caribbean and in many parts of the third world, and there is no mutuality in this, it is on our side. Many children, 7, 8 years old, when they come to paint things in school, these paintings, and they have to paint their sister, their mother, or somebody. Because now of television, you see the influence continues through another medium. They paint this, this wronged face, that wronged icon for the mother, and they put 2 lovely blue pools for her eyes, and then this corn hair flowing at the back. That's my mom. That's my sister, because that is the images that they see privileged in the world around them. And it's very difficult when that happens to ask and expect a person to develop a poetry which does what has to be done, the restoration of your own broken and submerged images. So I was able, because of what I'm telling you, to write a poem such as this. And it leads to something even more important. Every Friday morning, my grandfather left his farm of cane fields, chickens, cows, and rattled in his trap down to the harbor town to sell his meat. He was a butcher, 6'3" and very neat, high collar winged, a grey cravat, a waistcoat, watch chain just above the belt, thin narrow-bottomed trousers, and the shoes his wife would polish every night. He drove the trap himself, slap of the leather reins along the horse's back, and he'd be off with a top-hearted Homburg on his head. Black, English, country, gentleman. Now he is dead. The meat shop burned, his property divided. A doctor bought the horse, his mad Alsatians killed it. The wooden trap was chipped and chopped by friends and neighbors and used to stop gap fences and for firewood. One yellow wheel was rolled across the former cowpen gate. Only his hat is left. I borrowed it. I used to try it on and hear the night wind man go battering through the canes, cocks waking up and thinking it was dawn throughout the clinking country night. Great caterpillar tractors clatter down the broken highway now. A diesel engine grunts where pigs once hunted garbage. A thin, asthmatic cow shares the untrashed garage. Now, you see, I spoke earlier about my own roundhouse there falling into neglect. Here is another sacred space which is again being neglected. All of that history of plantation effort which went into my grandfather and his whole generation of people is now being neglected by modernism. The garage becoming, well, his cow pen, the place where he kept the cows, becoming an untrashed garage. The asthmatic instruments taken over. You know, the whole thing, no connection between one generation and another, repeating the notion of collapse, which is a part of our history. Now let me explain one more thing, because you see why I said this thing has to go on longer perhaps than the IDB would expect. They said 7 o'clock and I'm trying for 7, but you see there's so many other things to be said. For instance, that Caribbean archipelago which I mentioned, that arc of islands, you know, when you look at it, you skid the stone and you bloom the islands, but it easily becomes a tourist brochure, right? People do not realize that skidded archipelago, those islands that we see, Cuba, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, St. Croix, Grenada, you know, are the sunken tops of a mountain range. You're looking at a fantastic geopsychic disaster which took place about 1.5 million years ago, when the Cordillera that was at right angles to the great western Cordillera of the Americas, the Rockies, the Sierras and the Andes. There was another chain at right angles to them, but because of the tectonic movements of the earth, this second, more fragile mountain range perturbed itself and fell finally cataclysmically into the ocean, leaving only the tips of these mountains, which we call islands. And the people of the Caribbean have inherited the echo of that disaster. And the notion of fragmentation has become a geopsychic part of our viscera. And if you begin to look at the history of the Caribbean, you will see that this fragmentation has persisted. It has persisted in every way possible. Politically, fragmentation. Linguistically, fragmentation. Religiously, fragmentation. Socially, fragmentation. As if the people who inherit that landscape are walking in the ghosts of that original yawn out of Yucatan, which created Atlantis and which created those little Isola. Now what happens with Isola is that there is a dream, a wish for restoration. There's always a dream for restoration, that the mountains should rise once more out of the water and become once more a wonderful Cordillera. Or that the people who live on these small islands will reunite with the mainland in some way by building bridges or by migrating, of course, which is the way that we have been following recently, or by imitating the virtues and the non-virtues of that mainland, so that the mainland becomes a kind of mirror for this fragmented society. So we have this dichotomy set up between the two. And when we downgrade our history, when we fail to recognize the nature of it, we are perpetuating that situation where we cannot really properly heal and restore. There are many other factors in there too. For instance, as I said, we never knew growing up, and even today it is still a problematic business about slavery. Did we really have slavery? What kind of thing was it? What's the nature of it? And what I'm saying is that unless you have a ceremony that recognizes the death of 50 million people, unless you can go out in boats and throw flowers on that ocean, you are encouraging ghosts to haunt you forever. You're encouraging cries in the psychic night. You are encouraging the perpetuation of fragmentation, the difficulty of writing a whole poem, the crippling of the fingers that will create the poem. All of these are the things that the poetry teaches me. This is what I learn as I struggle to find the right rhythm and the right cadences for these things. So that when I talked about the thin asthmatic cow shares the untrashed garage, to me it is a terrible disaster taking place, because what the achievement of that simple little village, or what appears to be a simple little village, which becomes the heart of my poetry, becomes the subject of national neglect and often of national contempt. Next door to my grandfather, no, before that, just let me show you something else here. Because the grandfather has a wife, my grandmother, and this is what she teaches. And again, you come now to the situation where women in the Caribbean are treated as submerged icons. They are part of that underwater activity, that unseen activity, very important, but Sycoraxian, not really part of the visible universe. All that I can remember of his wife, my father's mother, is that she sang us songs. All that I can remember is that she sang us songs. But you see, those songs become very important indeed. I cannot remember her conversation, but the songs she sang carry a message from one generation to the next. I remember those songs as I come to write my poetry. I remember all these actions that she performed, the warmth of her body, the warmth of her intention towards me, which I could not find in school, which I could not find on Bronx Beach, which I could not find in the literature that I was reading. So again, you have a fragmentation between the literature you read in school and the real people who you are growing up with. But in school they tell you that the real people you're growing up with are unreal. That is where the whole thing happens all the time. They are not real. This grandmother of mine, I don't even know her name. I mean, think of that. I mean, I know the name now, but in the poetry, which is really the answer to the whole thing, I do not name her because in my imagination, she is the woman who did these things. But those things create this poem, which you should really contrast with the grandfather's poem. Black English country gentleman. That was his persona, black English country gentleman. All that I can remember of his wife, my father's mother, is that she sang us songs. Great Tommy's cast was one that frightened me. And she would go chug-chugging with a jar of milk until its white pap turned to yellow butter. And in the basket underneath the stairs, she kept the polish for grandfather's shoes. You remember that earlier I said she polished his shoes, right? All that I have of her is voices, laughing me out of fear because a crapo jumped and splashed the dark where I was huddled in the galvanized tin bath. Telling us stories round her fat white lamp. It was her Queen Victoria lamp, she said, although the stamp read ever ready. And in the night, I listened to her singing in a Vicks and vapor rub-like voice, what you would call the blues. Come a look, see what happened. Come a look, see what happened. Suki dead, Suki dead, Suki dead, oh. Suki dead, Suki dead, Suki dead, oh. A miracle of recovery, that I could remember that. Because I should have really been, think of me having to say, she sang us, drink to me only with thine eyes. Look at, do you see what has happened there? The whole business of, you see, and the way she sang this song was not supposed to be do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. It was not an ascending ladder. It was not linear. It was not correct. She was hoarse. It was Vicks and vapor rub like voice, what you would call the blues. But it carried the memory of an important lament for dead slaves. Come a look, see what happened. And she gives a name, Suki dead, Suki dead. You notice how that note falls right down in 7 octaves practically, Suki dead. That is not correct according to the people who teach you choral music. You know, when they do. But that is the music of the sacred spaces which I'm working towards. That is the music of the real history, the hidden history of our people. Now, the next door to my grandfather was his brother, called Bob. Robert, Robert. But he was called Bob because onomatopoeically he had a limp, so he went like this. So Bob happened to be his name. Although Bob is also, as you can see now, as you get to know later, it is the persona for the god Legba, which is a whole other area, which I don't know if you know enough about that for me to go into. But when you see a person limping in the Caribbean imagination, that limper, that cripple, is very likely to be a person standing in a doorway to understanding, and should not be laughed at, although usually, children laugh at these bobobs. But these are the people who open doors in the mythology of the Caribbean. In the mythology that says Suki dead, it is in that area there that Legba appears, in that flattened fifth, in that suppressed seventh. And this Bobob was a carpenter, and in his little shop, he created the most beautiful furniture. He was one of the great furniture architects of the island. Certainly in his parish of St. Peter, he created some of the most beautiful doors, windows, tables, rocking chairs. He was an artist. But no one took, what does that mean? Nothing at all. I mean, he was just producing things which people tried to exploit. They tried, Bob, I will take your rocking chair and I'll promise to pay you next month, and you never pay Bob. So Bob never gets wealthy, but he continues producing these things. And in his shop, there were icons on his wall which I could never find in school. Pictures of the Emperor Haile Selassie, pictures of the war against Mussolini's war against Ethiopia, pictures of the Sphinx and the pharaohs. Now, who are these people? 1066 and all that is what we got in school. No pictures of pyramid. Pyramid meant nothing. When my mother said that she was descended from the Egyptians, she was whispered, she's not quite. I had to listen to my mother being said not quite right in the head. She was characterized that way, because how could she, instead of saying the correct thing, I am descended from Henry VIII or from George Washington or whatever it is, which is pretty safe, accurate or inaccurate, it is safe, it is approved. You go and say you're descended from Hantepet or Akhenaten or somebody like that. And who are these people anyway? Who is Nefertiti? These people are, people from a fevered imagination. Bob had all these things, and he was teaching me subliminally about that. He also taught me that the village where we lived was a village, and that the people in that village were all related to me, that there was a web of kinship, which school said did not exist. We were supposed to be a dysnomic society, a society that did not have villages. We just had strings of houses along a main road, and we had lost that web of kinship which people in West Africa would have known. So we were isolated scatterits, we were fragmented. He said that's not true. He said, when you come to Milan Quarter, is the name of the village, you will notice, he's teaching, right, that when you arrive, you have to go to every one of these homes to say, hello, I have come. And they will greet you, look at you, check you out, see how tall you're growing, how ugly you've become. That you go through this, what you call humiliation. But actually you're going through a ritual which, as a youngster, you wouldn't know you were. You are affirming and keeping connection, that whole web. There are about 15 houses, as I discovered later, in that area around my grandfather's house, where we were all related. That was a village. That is a village in West African terms. That is a kith and kin situation. But still, when I left the Caribbean, I left with the idea in my head, in my conscious head, that we were a Philistine society and had no webs of kinship. We had no ancestral backative, no ancestral foundation. That is what I spouted as I went somewhere else. But Bob taught me differently. And then the other thing about Bob is that on Sundays, when his shop was closed, had to respect Sunday, he was whittling away, because he's a carpenter, he was whittling away at an image, working on this little zemi, this little thing, of his notion of what Africa was. He could not show it to anyone, because if he did, he would have been certified as insane or even as a criminal. Those laws are still on Caribbean statute books. Carving certain kinds of things can get you into big legal problems, because it's supposed to be obi of black magic, negative activity. But Bob was carving this little image of Africa. And I went away finally to study in England. And he, while I was away, died. And again, the neglect. This beautiful home that he had built with his own hands of wood, which used to sing on moonlight nights like a harp, surrounded by shack trees. I mean, this was like a miracle. When the moonlight came through the cracks of his house, it was like a rainbow in space. Things like that. And was always full not only of the music of nature, but the music of his daughters. He died, and that house fell into disrepair, fell into neglect, collapsed. When I returned, I found the house, just the ruins of all the wood had, by the time I got back to Barbados, all the wood of that home had gone. People had stolen it, people had taken it away, it had been burnt, only the foundations were left. And one day, going through these ruins ceaselessly, trying to find where Bob was, because, you see, I returned not only from England, but by this time I'd also gone to Africa. And I knew now that what he had been telling us was true, that there were such people as pharaohs and the Sphinx. There was such a thing as a web of kinship, and that our village was really a village. And I wanted somehow to make this connection with him, because he's the person who had legbud me into that understanding. One day I stumbled, my toe seemed to be searching for something. My toe hit something in that ruin. And when I bent down and picked it up, it was that zemi. It was that's how I knew that he had been carving this figure. That is how I knew, a little image he had whittled about Africa. And I realized then that it was that carving that made me create that curve that took me to Africa on his behalf. That I was following his metaphorical footsteps into another understanding. My uncle made chairs, tables, balanced doors on, dug out coffins, smoothing the white wood out with plain and quick sandpaper until it shone like his short-sighted glasses. The knuckles of his hands were silvered knobs of nails hurt and flattened out with blast of heavy hammer. He was knock-kneed, flat-footed, and his clip-clop sandals slapped across the concrete flooring of his little shop, where cane-field mulemen and a fleet of Bedford lorry drivers dropped in to scratch themselves and talk. There was no shock of wood, no beam of light mahogany his saw teeth couldn't handle. When shaping squares for locks, a keyhole care tapped rat-tat-tat upon the handle of his humped-back chisel. Cold world of wood caught fire as he whittled. Rectangle window frames, the intersecting X of folding chairs, triangle trellises, the donkey box cart in its creaking square. But he was poor, and most days he was hungry. Imported cabinets with mirrors, formica tabletops, spine-curving chairs made up of tubes with hollow steel-like bird bones that sat on rubber plows, thin beds stretched not on boards but blue high-tension cables were what the world preferred. And yet he had a block of wood that would have baffled them. With knife and gimlet care, he worked away at this on Sundays, explored its knotted hurts, cutting his way along its yellow whorls until his hands could feel how it had swelled and shivered breathing air, its weathered green burning to rings of time, its contoured grain still tuned to roots and water. And as he cut, he heard the creak of forests. Green lizard faces gulped. Gray memories with moth eyes watched him from their shadows. Soft liquid tendrils leaked among the flowers, and the black rigid thunder he had never heard within his hammer came stomping up the trunks. And as he worked within his shattered Sunday shop, the wood took shape. Dry, shuttered eyes, slack, anciently everted lips, flat, ruined face, eaten by pox, ravaged by rat and woodworm, dry cistern mouth, cracked gullet crying for the desert, the heavy black enduring jaw, lost pain, lost iron, emerging woodwork image of his anger. And I wrote that poem before I even went to Africa. So you see, I had already started to imagine how he imagined his Africa. And as I said, when I found the evidence of the connection, it is one of the most precious possessions that I have, that after so many 25 years, I should stumble upon that thing that he, I suppose, had left for me, which meant that this place, this little village of Milan Quarter, had become for me a sacred space. And even today, I'm glad to say that the ruin remains inviolate. No one has built upon that ruin. It has not yet been made into a supermarket, but it has remained neglected, except for one thing. From time to time, people have rented that space as a kind of people's church. And I've heard songs coming from that space, which I'm going to speak of in this last part of what I'm going to say. Because that what I heard coming from that space, from that church one evening, confirmed to me that Barbados had a very strong connection with West African culture. A connection which no one in Barbados admitted, which no one in Barbados had even recognized consciously, but which, since I myself had lived in West Africa, what I heard that evening in that bob-up space made me understand that here was a miraculous healing, a miraculous reconnection of two apparently shattered cultures. But before that, I had to go to England. And when I went to England, as you can imagine, I tried, having been educated at, these Barbadian schools, Little England schools, I went to England on the understanding that I was a citizen of the Commonwealth, possibly a citizen of the world, Cambridge University, what else, you know? And that my poetry would be accepted as all citizens of the world's poetry would be accepted on its own terms and nothing else. I thought I was a poet. Although when I went there, I did not have enough strength or understanding to submit or to write the poems which I had started writing in Barbados. I did not submit. The stone had skidded. I started to submit the poems that sounded more like my own name, Brathwaite or Brathwaite, Oh Little Pool, Oh Little Fool. And you know, the rejections came not only because of what I looked like, but because the poems were not any good. I think so. That's a great lesson to learn. But the first poem that was accepted is a very interesting poem. Interesting in many ways because it shows me and it showed them, although they did not know who I was when I submitted it, that you come from a place that does not really understand snow. All these years I've read my Dickens, Christmas Carol and all that, Scrooge walking through all this snow. Do you know we thought that snow fell like rain and that it would make a sound on the galvanized roof like rain does? When I got to England and snow was silent, it was a traumatic experience. And when it started, when it was blowing upwards rather than downwards, it was worse. Couldn't believe it. But it was part of a very important stage of education that literature has to have a reality component to it. If not, your imagination can lead you into false assumptions. The poem I submitted was called The Day the First Snow Fell, and it was not only accepted, but it was highly praised for its perception in its first and last stanzas of the poem reenacted the falling of snow. That is how the critics put it. And these are critics who have become famous now, you know. And they said that what was interesting about the poem is my use of the word touch. Because when the snow first falls, it touches the earth and it melts, and then it touches again, and it goes on touching until finally it makes its statement. And I perceive that. And an Englishman or people living in snow would have taken that for granted. That there's a phase, a twilight before the snow becomes snow. The day the first snow fell, I floated to my berth of feathers, falling by my window, touched earth and melted, touched again and left a little touch of light, and everywhere we touched till earth was white. Beautiful, they like that, and so did I. The day the first snow fell, I floated to my berth of feathers, falling by my window, touched earth and melted, touched again and left a little touch of light, and everywhere we touched till earth was white. But there were two stanzas in the center of that poem, which they published the poem, but the critics who praised the poem did not deal with. And they didn't deal with it, I now realize, because it contains elements that were uncomfortable, which they wished were not there, which did not fit in to the romantic notion of snow being an integument. And those two stanzas, which to me are the heart of the poem because they are placed in a different position within the poem. The stanzas, 4 lines are long lines, and then it ends the day this first snow fell, I floated to my death of feathers. But you have these short lines in the middle. And this comes about because when I got to England, the rejection of my poetry, the rejection of myself as poet was very, very painful experience. Very, very painful experience. I felt that although I came as a citizen of the world, that people were not recognizing me for what I was. And it was true. There was an element of prejudice, right? When it was that they assumed, when I sent my poems by post, and it was poems sent by Edward Brathwaite, or Brathwaite as they would say, the poems were English and therefore they could be published. But who tell me to go and appear in person? Here now comes the dichotomy. Here is English poetry written by a person who does not look English. Therefore, rejection of the poems, because somehow the two things don't fit. But it was worse than that, because I went to my lecture room, like you're sitting here in the lecture hall. Here is an adolescent coming all the way from Little England. Little England, don't forget. I'm going on a scholarship. I represent, I'm sorry the ambassador is not here. He is another example. I represent the island, I'm the one who won the scholarship to go to Cambridge University, citizen of the world. I started a drama society in Barbados, and as soon as I got, the next morning I didn't even wait to jet lag, or of course it was by boat, so it wasn't so much lag. I did not even wait a moment. I rushed to the theater, the Cambridge Playhouse Theater, where, guess who? The man who is now Sir Peter Hall, if not Lord whatever, he was there on the stage, and I said, I have come. I mean, what else, open, transparency, I've come. He said, come to do what? Because he had not yet seen Othello played by he did not know my dreams of Hollywood and the whole lot, So I said, I've come to join your theater, I've come for my parts, I've come to take the place by storm. And he looked at me. Now this is perfect theater behavior. Don't forget there's no prejudice involved in this, although it is so fine-edged that he looked at me and said, he went, in fact he didn't say anything at first, he went backstage and brought a broom. And he said, can you sweep the stage? I went home for 3 weeks, in bed, couldn't take it. What he was